Welcome back to All of Christ. All of Christ is a ministry of Remembrance Community Church, and you're joining me this week from a special location here at the beach in Ponce Inlet, Florida. And I promise you a view of the beach, so that is what you're getting as we're finishing up chapter 5 of the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. We looked at paragraphs 1 through 3 last week as we considered God's doctrine of providence. And we've seen how providence relates to God's decree, that God's decree is essentially the blueprint of God's plan for all things, that all things come to pass and happen according to the predetermined plan of God, and that God has decreed the ends, but God has also decreed the means to the ends. If God's decree is the blueprint, God's providence is his special care for working out that blueprint. Now this week, as we conclude our thoughts, and I want to be more brief this week because we're enjoying some good family time out here, but as we conclude our thoughts about divine providence, I want you to consider how providence relates to God's special care for his people. I'm going to turn this video around so you can get a little bit of a view of my face, although I'm sure you'd rather look at this. You know, the word providence means special care or attention giving to something or someone before time. And so God's providence, in his providence, he does give a special care and attention to the world, to all things. God has created all things for himself and for his own glory. But listen to what paragraph 7 here in chapter 5 of the Confession has to say. It says, the providence of God in a general way includes all creatures, but in a special way it takes care of his church and arranges all things to its good. The book of Romans says that God works all things together for good. But it doesn't stop there. I think sometimes we like to hear those verses and to cling to those verses, and we should as believers, but it doesn't stop there. It says God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his plan. God is working things together for good for his people, and that includes, as paragraph 4 says, it includes his sovereign plan includes even the first fall and every other sinful action, both of angels and of human beings. Every single sinful action in human history, God is still working together for good for his people who are called according to his plan, his purpose. Sometimes we really kind of want our plan, but as you look back on your life, maybe you can thank God most of all for some of the unanswered prayers, right? Some of the things we thought that our plan was the right plan and we really wanted God to go with our plan, but his plan has always shown to be so much better. Now, it's difficult for us to think sometimes how God does use sinful actions for his good and how God uses the evil actions of other people in our lives. We've talked in depth about Genesis chapter 50, and rightfully so, about the story of Joseph and his brothers and how they sold him into slavery, and they meant that for evil. But Genesis chapter 50 says, you meant that for evil, but God purposed it. He meant it for good. We've talked about Acts chapter 2, verse 23, where early on in the church after Pentecost, the Apostle Peter is preaching, and he's preaching one of the first gospel sermons, and he's talking to these leaders and these Jewish people who shortly before this had been responsible for the murder of Jesus. They'd really done it. It was really sin. But Acts chapter 2 verse 23 says, this happened. You did this. You did this. But it happened according to the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. I want you to consider one other passage. I want you to consider this passage from Isaiah 10. This is Isaiah 10, and it's beginning in verse 5. In Isaiah 10, we're learning about Assyria's conquering of Israel. And listen how God purposed and planned the conquering of his own people Israel by Assyria, ultimately for his good and ultimately for their good. Isaiah 10 verse 5, woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. He begins by saying, woe to Assyria. Assyria is the rod of God's anger. God is using Assyria to pour out his anger upon his covenant people who have left him. They're doing what God has purposed for them to do. But he says what? Woe to them. This is an evil thing for these people to do, but God is purposing this for good. I send it, Assyria, against a godless nation, his people, and command it against the people of my fury, to capture soil and seize plunder, and to trample them down like mud in the streets. But it does not intend to act this way, and it does not think in its heart in this way. Rather, what is in its heart is to destroy and to cut off many nations. Assyria was sent by God to bring covenant punishment upon his people Israel. And yet that wasn't the plan of Assyria. The Assyrian king, as he sent his people to do this, he didn't send them to do that thinking, okay, we're carrying out the plans of Yahweh, we're carrying out the plans of God. No, they did it for evil. They did it for plunder. They did it to destroy nations, because that was what they would do. They were wicked in their hearts, and yet they did it because it was God's plan, and yet they did it for their own purposes. Maybe you're beginning to see now how these things ultimately work together. Verse 8, it says, "For it says, are not my princes all kings? Is not Calno of Carchemish or Hamath of Arpad or Samaria like Damascus? As my hand has reached to the kingdoms of the idols whose graven images were greater than those in Jerusalem and Samaria, shall I not do to Jerusalem and her idols, just as I have done to Samaria and her idols?" All of the kings of the world, all of the affairs of the world, they're in the hand of God. All of the kings of the world. You're going to get a little bit of a sight as we finish this video. I know you're losing my face here. That's the most important thing, right? All of the kings of the world, their hearts are like rivers in God's hand. And God works all things, all the affairs of the universe, all of the things that we might look at and say these are wicked, horrible things happening in the world. God is working all these things together for good, for his people. He has a special providence, a special love and care for his people. And that's kind of what I wanted to share with you today. We're going to get back next week into the regular flow of our videos, maybe a little bit longer one with chapter 6, but I wanted to share just a short reflection with you here from the beach. Here, take another look. There you go. All right. See you next week.